Hey everybody, it's Chris, and we are doing subclass rankings for the Druid. And I did Circle of the Land in my last video, and today we're going to go over what, in my experience, is the most popular subclass for Druids, Circle of the Moon. And the Circle of the Moon Druid was very popular in the 2014 rules, especially before we started to see some of the more powerful Druid subclasses come out later, like Circle of the Shepherd Druid comes to mind. That kind of took over Druids eventually. But certainly with the 2014 Player's Handbook alone, Circle of the Moon was basically every Druid I saw was Circle of the Moon. And now with the 2024 rules, I do see the other Druid subclasses, but Circle of the Moon remains probably the most popular option that I've seen in my experience as a DM. And I think it makes sense that it is, and that is because part of the class fantasy that a lot of people have with the Druid is that in combat, the Druid will turn into an animal. And in the case of every other Druid that's not Circle of the Moon, they probably don't want to do that. Wild Shape for other Druids is a utility feature. It allows them to scout places they couldn't scout, climb places they couldn't climb, swim places they couldn't swim. And it also fuels other subclass features that aren't Wild Shape. While Circle of the Moon enhances Wild Shape so that you can take forms that work okay in combat. There are issues with that I will be getting into this video, but if your class fantasy for Druid is that you are going to turn into an animal in combat, then this is the subclass that you want. And it says, adopt animal forms to guard the wilds. Druids of the Circle of the Moon draw on lunar magic to transform themselves. Their order gathers under the moon to share news and perform rituals. Changeable as the moon, a Druid of this circle might prowl as a great cat one night, soar over the treetops as an eagle the next day, then crash through the undergrowth as a bear to drive off a trespassing monster. The wild is in the Druid's blood. So what I do in these videos is I go over each of the levels that the subclass gets new features. We go over those features, and then I give a ranking to that level of features. And the ranking will be from 1 to 5 stars. And by the time this series is complete, I'll have gone over all the Druid subclasses, including the older ones. And the average for any particular level should be about 3 stars. All right, so we are going to look at level 3 first for Circle of the Moon. And the first feature we get is Circle Forms. And it says you channel lunar magic when you assume a wild shape form, granting you the benefits below. And there's 3 features below: challenge rating, armor class, and temporary hit points. I will be going from the bottom up here. And the reason I want to talk about temporary hit points first is it is the only part of this that has an impact when you aren't wild shaped. It says you gain a number of temporary hit points equal to 3 times your Druid level, and that's when you assume a wild shape form. But just like the basic Druid, the non-Circle of the Moon Druid, that gets temporary hit points when they wild shape, those temporary hit points aren't lost if you revert to your normal form, as long as you still have them. And that's the case here as well. So this can have a pretty big impact. Like if you are thinking maybe a 15th level Druid, and you for some reason you don't want a wild shape in combat, or you just want to be moving around in your normal form for some reason or another, well, then you could, outside of combat, use a wild shape, get 45 temporary hit points, turn back to your normal form, and you still have 45 temporary hit points. And that's a lot of temporary hit points. The scaling on this is good. Now, next we'll talk about the armor class. It says until you leave the form, your armor class equals 13 plus your wisdom modifier if that total is higher than Beast's armor class. Now, when you are wild shape, this is definitely a benefit because the beast whose form you took, its armor class was lower than that. And so with 13 plus your wisdom modifier, that means at level 3, it's probably a 16. And then eventually it'll be an 18 once your wisdom is 20. And that's maybe at level 8. And then it probably won't move much from there. Now, is this a general benefit? No, it's not, because your regular form probably has an armor class very similar or higher. At higher levels, it's probably higher because, you can do medium armor and shields with a Druid if you choose the right selection. That's half plate and shield. That's an 18 armor class. Assuming you get like a +1 shield at some point or other, or a ring of protection, or something else that increases your armor class, then we would have a higher armor class when we aren't wild shaped. So our wild shape armor class is going to go down, but other druids, their armor class, while they're wild shaped, nosedives. It just goes right down. In the case of the Moon Druid, this armor class feature allows us to more or less maintain our armor class when we wild shape. So it definitely helps us while we're wild shaped in combat. And then challenge rating. The maximum challenge rating for the form equals your druid level divided by 3. And at level 3, when you first get this feature, this is lovely, because we have a wonderful selection of challenge rating 1 beasts that do all kinds of different things. We can have different kinds of attacks. We can have multiple attacks. We can have attacks that knock you prone. We can have web attacks that attack at range and restrain you. We can choose forms that can climb walls. We can choose forms that can swim. We can choose forms that can move very quickly and bear a rider. All kinds of different things we can do with wild shape when we are level 3. As we go up in level, there are big problems with this part of the feature. And I went over those in a large portion of my recent wild shape video that I will link up above. I talk specifically about moon druids and the problems with wild shape with moon druids, and that will affect my ranking here. So if you have not seen that video, I'm not going to repeat everything right now, but what I will say is that it really hurts as you go up in level, and just the number of forms and the variance in forms goes down as the challenge ratings go up, and dramatically down. Like even when we get to challenge rating 2, the difference in terms of variance for challenge rating 2 creatures versus challenge rating 1 is night and day, and it only gets worse. And that makes it so that if your class fantasy wasn't just that you'd be an animal in wild shape in combat, but also that you'd be this big scary animal and rip enemies apart, that class fantasy unfortunately is not achievable in higher levels of D&D. There is nothing that does it. And Circle of the Moon doesn't change that. And we will also find that when we get into those higher challenge ratings, we can't even always use those forms. We don't have flying options at the higher challenge rating. So if you need to fly and you don't have another method to do so, you're out of luck. Also, we have almost no size variance at those higher challenge ratings. You get to the point where your options are huge or huge. And so if you are in an area where huge doesn't work, you can't take those forms. So you can very easily end up in a situation where even when you get to high levels and those bigger challenge ratings are all available, that you're still stuck with challenge rating 1 forms because nothing else is going to fit. And those forms, they do not scale. So you can end up using the form that you were using at level 3 at high level. In fact, you probably even wouldn't want to wild shape, except that this subclass is going to give you other benefits when you wild shape. So you definitely want to wild shape to access those benefits. And so this is not a feature that works well. It works very, very poorly. And that is unfortunate. It works great at level 3, but as you get up in level, it's almost a hindrance to have to take wild shape. And so it almost becomes an anti-feature. It's very odd that way because there's features that don't scale well, and there's features that don't scale at all, but there's very seldom a feature where it kind of becomes a penalty. And this is like the only one I can think of in the game that does. It's just the unfortunate reality of having to choose between stat blocks, and there's just not enough stat blocks at those higher challenge ratings, to the point where there's almost none. And if you want your best forms, you gotta choose those. And if you're in the exact right situation, it's not that bad. Like, I'll be a mammoth in the right combat, and it'll be okay. But for the other combats, what it does is it forces you into a wild shape form where you can't really make good attacks and do good stuff in combat, except cast spells, which is something you couldn't do previously. And that's what we're going to cover now. Circle of the Moon spells. When you reach a druid level specified in the Circle of the Moon spells table, you thereafter always have the listed spells prepared. In addition, you can cast the spells from this feature while you are in a wild shape form. And the spells we get at level 3 are Starry Wisp, Moonbeam, and Cure Wounds, which are all good spells. And very different spells. Starry Wisp is a range cantrip, pretty average range cantrip. Moonbeam is a space laser that comes down and you move it around using your action and you burn all the enemies on the ground with radiant damage. Cure Wounds is, of course, a great way to restore hit points. Then at level 5, we get Conjure Animals. This also allows you an area that you move around and damage enemies, except this one doesn't use up your action. It can just be part of your movement, which means that if we are some kind of creature, like let's say we are a mammoth, and we're in there and we're doing our stomps and our gores, we can also move around our Conjure Animals. And in fact, our Conjure Animals might be more effective than our Wild Shape attacks, even when we can use the Wild Shape semi-effectively, which is a good thing, because otherwise Moon Druids would be terrible at high levels if they Wild Shaped. But because we can use spells like Conjure Animals, which upscales really well. So if, we don't want to use a level 3 spell, we were hoping to cast a level 6 spell. Well, you cast a level 6 Conjure Animals, and it's good. And thank goodness for that. Fount of Moonlight increases the damage of your base attacks, your melee attacks, and it can potentially blind enemies. And the increased damage on your base attacks is probably going to be significantly less damage than you're going to get out of Conjure Animals. So it would really be for something that you're hoping to blind things. Though you should keep in mind that as a Moon Druid, unfortunately, as you go up beyond level 3 and we get into those higher challenge rating creatures, even when we can use them, your chance to hit is going to be worse than everybody else in the party. It's also going to be worse than you if you were not wild shaped and cast a spell. Your base spell attack is higher than the attack of the creatures as you go up. So there is always the possibility you won't hit, and then you're not going to get the benefit. And then Mass Cure Wounds, which is good. It's you need to heal multiple creatures, heals a lot of creatures, a reasonable amount of hit points. This is still a really good list. These are all pretty good spells, and they are all Druid spells. There's not a single spell here that's not on the Druid spell list, but these are all solid spells, which means I have all kinds of preparations I can use for other Druid spells. And furthermore, while I'm wild-shaped, I have a good list of spells to choose from and cast from, meaning that if I want to wild shape in combat, I'm always going to have a spell I can cast. And that's great. Thank goodness for that. In fact, this list is, if we looked at Circle of the Land, which I covered last video, they choose from 4 different spell lists, and all of those spell lists are dramatically worse than this one. If I could mix and match spells from each of those spell lists, I might be able to make a list as good or better than this one, but you can't. You have to pick one, and you're stuck with it till your next long rest. Well, here we're always going to have a really solid list of spells, so I would actually say this is better than the Land Druid's options for spell casting, not even taking into account that we can cast these while we're wild-shaped. So this is a very good feature, and the temporary hit points is very good. Armor class basically prevents you from being penalized to your armor class by wild shape, and challenge rating is good at level 3, but not fantastic. It's good, and it becomes anti-good as we go up in level. Still, we're above average, I'd say, at level 3, so 4 stars. That's the level that's going to take the most time to explain. We're going to move through the rest of these pretty quickly. We now have improved circle forms at level 6. We only gain these benefits while we are wild-shaped. So if you are not wild-shaped, you don't gain these benefits. And when I said earlier that you might want to wild-shape into a beast, even if it's not a good beast for combat, is because you want to access the second of these features. The first one is Lunar Radiance. Each of your attacks in wild shape form can deal its normal damage or radiant damage, and you make the choice each time you attack. And this only matters if the creature you're fighting has a different resistance, immunity, or vulnerability to radiant than it does to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing, which in most cases it won't. In 2014, instead, this feature was your attacks were treated as magical, and in 2014, that was super important because monsters, once we got to a certain challenge rating, most of them had resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from a non-magical attack. But now that's gone, and most creatures don't have resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing, so you're probably fine with your regular attacks, but it does give you an extra level of reliability with those attacks. Though, as we go up in level, depending on the combat, that might not be a big portion of your actual combat ability. And increased toughness. This is the big one. You can add your wisdom modifier to your constitution saving throws, but only when you're wild-shaped. That's going to be, at level 6, it's probably +4. And then at level 8, it's probably +5. I want that. I definitely want that. So I am going to wild shape even if I don't really have a good form to wild shape into. If I'm at high challenge ratings and Mammoth isn't going to work, maybe I'm in a small room and it just isn't going to fit, well, I'll wild shape into a bird. That's fine. I get a bunch of temporary hit points, and I'm going to get a huge bonus to my Constitution saving throws, which is the most common save in the game, and it's all our concentration saves. So we're getting that built-in concentration protection, and then I'll use my Conjure Animals, and then, with my action, I won't be making natural attacks as a bird, so I'll Starry Wisp, and, I'll be decent in combat with strong defenses. Pretty good. 4 stars, above average. And then we get to level 10. Level 10 gives us Moonlight Step, and this is a very common feature, and it seems if the Unearthed Arcana are any indication, it's going to become more and more common as we go on, the ability to teleport using your bonus action to a space you can see within 30 feet of you. Right now, it's already reasonably common to be able to do this through subclass features or through species traits and spells, but it's still good. Being able to teleport is good, and if you don't have a way to teleport already, you probably want one. And druid spells are not particularly good for teleporting, so having another method to teleport is a good idea. So if you're not going to play something like a Cloud Giant Goliath, well, then you can get Moonlight Step and you can do the teleports. And in this case, it's a number equal to your wisdom modifier, and if you run out, you can expand a second or higher level spell slot and refresh the ability. And it's not super exciting, unfortunately, in the 2024 rules to be able to teleport. It's pretty mundane, but not everybody teleports. You're still going to have, a party, and there's going to be people in there who can't teleport. So it's not like everybody can do it. And it's pretty average. It's 3 stars. And then we get to our level 14 feature, and it's Lunar Form. The power of the moon suffuses you, granting you the following benefits. Improved lunar radiance. Once per turn, you can deal an extra 2d10 radiant damage to your target you hit with a wild shape form's attack. And I've already spoken in this video that you're not always going to be able to attack in your wild shape form, or it's not always going to be good. And when you do attack, your chance to hit will be lower, especially by level 14. It definitely will be lower. And so there is a decent chance you won't hit with any attack on your turn, but most forms you take are going to be making 2 attacks. So with 2 attacks, you probably hit. And then you should get that 2d10 damage, as long as you can take a form effectively in the combat that can make attacks semi-effectively. Then this is going to help with the damage, as will your Primal Strike feature from Base Druid. So you'll do good damage when you hit. And the base forms will do good damage as well, because the damage is one thing that does scale as you go up in challenge rating. But there will just be aware that there will be cases where there will be combats you're not going to really have access to this feature, or not a good access to this feature, because you'll be a creature that has like 1 attack with a low chance to hit, and so you probably want to do a Starry Wisp with your action. Then we have Shared Moonlight, and this is the star of level 14. Whenever you use Moonlight Step, you can also teleport 1 willing creature. The creature must be within 10 feet of you, and you teleport it to an unoccupied space you can see within 10 feet of your destination space. And like I said before, a lot of players are going to have characters that can teleport, but not all of them. And some of them are, you get to level 14, some of them are going to get stuck in walls of force, for example. And what you could do is you could move up next to them, you can teleport them out of the wall of force, and you've really helped them, and you've only used your bonus action, and you still have your action free for attacks or spells. So that is really nice. It's one of the main reasons why Dimension Door is better than Misty Step. There's other reasons too, but one of the reasons is you can bring along somebody else. So yeah, that's a nice upgrade to that feature. And so at level 14, mainly because of Shared Moonlight, I think it is worth 3 stars. And so I don't have a level here where the Moon Druid is bad. They're getting 3 stars and 3 stars and 4 stars and 4 stars. That means out of the 4 various levels with an average score of 12, the Moon Druid actually scores 14. So they are above average. Also, we're getting a 4-star level at level 3 and a 4-star level at level 6, meaning that those early levels is when Circle of the Moon is really going to feel great. And that encourages a lot of people to play the subclass because those are the levels we see the most play at. So I absolutely recommend Circle of the Moon despite the issues it has. Just be aware that at higher levels, if your fantasy was that you're going to turn into this big, nasty creature and tear your enemies to shreds, it doesn't really work out that way. Your spells end up being more effective than your wild shape form at those higher challenge ratings. There's just no doubt about it. Not at level 3, but definitely by level 20. And that is the Circle of the Moon, and in my next video, we'll go over Circle of the Sea, which is a contentious one. Because, I've talked about this before. There are people online saying it's terrible, and I don't think it's terrible, but I will explain myself in the next video, and I sure hope you will join me. But until then, I am going to sit back and relax and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon.